Spoilers for Spider-Man No Way Home. If you're one of the maybe 5-6 people who hasn't seen it already, please click away, watch it first, and come right back. Ah, Spider-Man, who doesn't love the webhead? Apparently nobody, because unless you've been living under a rock for the past 8 months or so, you know that Spider-Man No Way Home came out and it made all the money. And I, for one, loved it. Along with countless others, I'm a huge Spider-Man fan, and I thought this movie was a fantastic ride and love letter to the character, with mind-blowing levels of fan service perfectly woven into meaningful storytelling. One of the reasons why I think No Way Home is a borderline perfect Spider-Man movie specifically is because the plot, from the ground up, is built around the core Spidey adage, with great power comes great responsibility. This phrase is pretty widely used, but it has always been essentially synonymous with the Spider-Man character, as a perfect summation of his character motivations. Most Spider-Man stories revolve around this core conflict. Peter Parker, whether he's a teenager in high school looking to fit in, or a grown man trying to make ends meet, has very relatable things he wants to do in his personal life. However, he's been gifted with incredible superhuman powers, and therefore he must sacrifice his own personal desires to spend much of his time fighting crime and the forces of evil. Because, after all, with great power comes great responsibility. And No Way Home, being the culmination of the MCU Spider-Man's unintentionally long origin story, finally lets this theme fully sink in for this version of the character. Each time Peter Parker makes a choice in this movie to help people, it always comes back around to bite him, but he persists nonetheless, because doing the right thing is simply what he should do, even if he will suffer because of it. To summarize, Peter's decision in the previous movie to abandon his fun summer vacation to stop the evil Mysterio results in his secret identity being revealed to the public. His attempt to erase this event to help his friends' reputations recover ends up pulling in interdimensional supervillains. His decision to stop Doctor Strange from sending these villains back to their respective universes in order to cure their ailments so they might not be killed results in them rebelling and an Aunt May dying, and the spell he accidentally unleashed earlier ends up threatening to destroy his universe, and so he finally decides to erase everyone's memory of Peter Parker entirely, now leaving him in a spot where his old self is essentially dead, with not even his girlfriend remembering who he is. This large, catastrophic snowball of actions and reactions, culminating in his greatest sacrifice of all, only happened because Peter Parker simply never stopped choosing to do the right thing, because he has a responsibility to do so. So why am I detailing the plot of Spider-Man No Way Home on a YouTube channel called The Creative Catholic? Well, because this character trait of Peter's speaks to a core principle of Christianity, and that is dying to self or self-denial. And I believe Spider-Man's core motivations can teach us how to be better Christians through this principle. So you might be asking what on earth dying to self means, because yeah, it sounds pretty ominous. Well, consulting sacred scripture is always a good first step when trying to figure something out. Here's an excerpt from the 16th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Then Jesus told his disciples, "If any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." So why exactly do Christians have to deny themselves if they want to follow Jesus? That sounds a little strange and concerning on the surface, right? We like ourselves. Well, self-denial thankfully does not mean erasing our personalities and becoming some robotic, holy husk of a human being. Here's why human beings need to deny themselves in order to follow Jesus. TLDR, every single human being to ever exist, except these two, has a nature that is inherently good, but broken. We are a broken species in need of fixing. Essentially, we believe in a God that is goodness, is truth, etc. Objectivity comes from God. If something is right in God's eyes, then it is just right. If it is wrong in God's eyes, then it is just wrong. There's no two ways about it. This makes sense because obviously the creator of all things has dominion over all things. God also gave us freedom, which is very good, since it means we're not merely his puppets. But that freedom can sadly be abused. So when we abuse that freedom, that's what we call sin. To explain why, let's dive into the book of Genesis. Yep, we're talking about Adam and Eve. So most, if not all of you, probably know the deal already. God granted Adam and Eve nearly full reign of his creation, but forbade them to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The devil tempted them to eat the fruit though, and they did, resulting in our now broken nature. The significance of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is that they are attempting to make morality subjective. This is what sin is. When we implicitly make ourselves the gods of our own universe and do things that we might want to do, but are objectively wrong in the eyes of God. And since we are creations of God, breaking our harmony with him and his creation by sinning is obviously not how we're supposed to function as a species. So the result of Adam and Eve's first sin is something that we call original sin. And original sin's effect on us is that each human, again except these two, has a constant intrinsic desire within them to sin. This is our broken nature. Human beings are sadly now always tilted inward, always focused on how they can serve themselves, rather than outward, focused on serving others and, by extension, God, as we should be. This brings us to a hard truth, that our lives are not all about us. Sure, it is not a bad thing at all to take care of yourself and to will your own good. And remember, we're not the holy husks from before. We're all called to be individuals with all kinds of unique personalities, interests, etc. However, we are gifted with these qualities, and with being alive in general, not to serve ourselves and our own selfish desires, but to serve God and the people around us. Essentially, self-denial is surrender. Surrendering control over our actions and our lives in general to God's supreme will, which means we'll have to give up things we want sometimes, even things that aren't necessarily sinful, in order to be an agent of good for God. The phrase dying to self should really make sense now. In fact, the Apostle Paul says in Galatians, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." Which brings us back to Spider-Man. Peter Parker's origin story in the comics involves him first using his powers only to benefit himself, resisting the opportunity to help others, which then results in the death of his uncle. Therefore, even though it can be very painful, Peter then chooses to always do the right thing, because with great power comes great responsibility. We can push this theme further in No Way Home if we examine the main villain, Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin. If Peter's journey in this movie is to learn that with great power comes great responsibility, the Goblin's manifesto is that with great power comes no responsibility. I won't play the clip for copyright reasons, but when Peter goes out of his way to try to fix each villain's ailments before sending them back to their respective universes in an attempt to change their fates and save their lives, the Green Goblin causes the villains to rebel with a speech. No, I'm not doing a goblin impression. No more darker half? Did you really think that I'd let that happen? That I'd let you take away my power just because you're blind to what true power can bring you? I saw how she trapped you, fighting her holy moral mission. We don't need you to save us. We don't need to be fixed. These are not curses, they're gifts. I've watched you from deep behind Norman's cowardly eyes, struggling to have everything you want, while the world tries to make you choose. Gods don't have to choose. Here's another example. Essentially, the Green Goblin is sin incarnate. He seeks to use his powers only for his own benefit in any way he wants to use them, and wholly rejects the idea of responsibility for the sake of the greater good. He even equates himself to a god, which is essentially what we implicitly do when we sin, hence why it's so heinous. Of course, Peter is like us in that he is tempted to sin, when, at the end of the movie, he desperately wants to kill the Green Goblin to avenge the murder of Aunt May. It's very telling here that the Goblin actually is excited at the prospect of Peter killing him, as it means he'll have to shed his moral code. However, good old Tobey Maguire thankfully stops him from doing so, they cure the Goblin, and the movie ends with Peter's greatest sacrifice of all, where he really takes the principle of dying to self to heart when he literally, or I guess figuratively, dies to self and has the entire world forget that he ever existed, so he can continue to fight for what's right. So here's another elephant in the room. Peter Parker might have always done the right thing in No Way Home, which is great, but he had to sacrifice a whole lot to do so. Doing the right thing can be extremely hard sometimes. Giving up a lifestyle of living only according to your desires and instincts, and instead surrendering to Jesus, means that you'll often come at a crossroads, where you know what the right thing to do is, but you really don't want to do it because doing that thing would be extremely difficult. Rest assured, we have a God who knows our struggles. Jesus, before his passion and death on the cross, was riddled with anxiety in the Garden of Gethsemane. So much so that he was sweating blood. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus prays to God the Father, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt." Jesus clearly was not excited to be humiliated, tortured, and killed. He even asks God if it was possible that this didn't have to happen for humanity to be saved from their sin. But what's key here is that even though he felt this way, he still surrendered to God's will. As a result, Jesus, without hesitation, voluntarily gave up his life so that we might all be forgiven for our sins and be saved in him. To put it simply, Jesus surrendered to God's will and did what he had to do, even though it was extremely difficult, because he had the means to do so and it was simply his God-given job. In other words, with great power comes great responsibility. If you are trying to live an authentically Christian life, it will be very hard at times, because Christianity is fundamentally countercultural. But we do need to understand that even though God may ask very difficult things of us sometimes, it's still our job to do those things. Because serving God will ultimately benefit others and ourselves, even when it might not feel like it. God knows our struggles and how hard it can be for us to serve him with our broken natures. He does not ask us to pretend that doing hard things is somehow easy, and he is always there to comfort us and to help us with our various crosses to bear. But at the end of the day, with great power comes great responsibility. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Please tell me if you enjoyed so I know if I should make more of these. I'm kind of experimenting here. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you feel so moved. And take care and God bless. Here's an excerpt from the 16th chapel of the